This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello, and welcome to this pre-Christmas episode of the podcast. I'm going to start with a few updates as to what's been going on with Roots and All. So I've redone the website, which I was able to do with the financial support of the Patreon members. So if you go to the website, you'll see that it's got a new look to it, new branding, and it's now got a bookshop. So when I interview people, quite often they've got a book out and you can now purchase the book through the website. And if you do that, not only do you support independent bookshops, but I get a small commission. So if you're thinking of buying the books, please do go and check them out on my website. I'm also starting to add transcripts to each episode, which is good for accessibility and is one of the things that's been requested. They are not fantastic. I do go through and edit them, but there are occasional blips. So please bear with me on that. And when you look at the transcripts, you realise how much additional and ahhing there is that goes on, particularly on my side in interviews. So I've tried to cut that out as much as possible, but they are now there. So I wanted to have a look back on what has been happening on the podcast this year in terms of interviews and guests. And I've picked out a few of not just my favourites, but ones that have particularly resonated with you. And the first one was Jo McKerr, who runs Pretensis Gardens, and she spoke about wildlife gardens. She's made her own wildlife garden. Do go and check out her Instagram. And it really encapsulates everything that the podcast is about. Her garden uses a lot of native plants and she gardens in a really wildlife friendly way. And it was just really refreshing to speak to somebody who's gardening in that style, and who's gaining quite a following. And she's very informed about gardening and horticulture and biodiversity. So that is just well worth checking out. And here's a clip from that interview now.
The short answer is no, I don't think we can rewild our gardens. But I do think that these ideas that rewilding has given us, these ideas that you can reinstate natural processes and you can restore biodiversity, I think they're useful goals to then assimilate into your garden design.
It's really interesting to think about the concept of rewilding and how it applies to gardens and whether it is something that we can do, we should be doing, and if it's even possible to do in a garden setting. The next guest who I really loved speaking to was Professor Jeff Ollerton, who's written a book called Pollinators and Pollination, and he talks here about bees.
Yeah, the honeybee bullshit machine is a phrase that I coined, which doesn't relate, specifically to people who keep honeybees and beekeepers and so on. It refers really to some environmental organisations that have ran campaigns around Save the Bees, or large companies and supermarkets and so on that have read these campaigns around Save the Bees and have misquoted statistics or made up statistics, or used the famous Einstein quote of if all of the bees on the planet were to die, humanity would only have 5 years left to live. There are various versions of it. First of all, it's not true. There are 20,000 species of bees on the planet, and honeybees are just one of them. But also, Einstein never said it. It was made up probably in the 1950s by someone who used a quote in a beekeeping magazine.
And Jeff is just the sort of person who I love speaking to on the podcast because he's done the research. It's his life's work. He just cuts through all the crap and the marketing, and he's very much like Dave Goulson. He's followed the money. He knows where sometimes things are cynical, things that we're encouraged to do as gardeners in the garden, and not always quite as transparent as they may seem and not quite as benevolent as maybe they could be, and why we all need to dig into the information that's presented to us, particularly in the media. And my next guest was Professor Glyn Percival, who I was desperate to speak to for a long time. He is just amazing. I've seen him speak. If you get the opportunity to do so, please go and do it because he's fantastic. The research he's doing is really groundbreaking, and it is mainly around trees, but it does have applications for horticulture in general.
And what we found is combinations of biochar and a mulch made solely from willow. We've had some, really excellent results, particularly with ash dieback. So we're finding this quite exciting. And what we're doing now is we're looking at different species of willow, because we have recently found that the salicylic acid content in red, the red stemmed willow, the Silex daphnoides, is literally 3-4 times higher than the salicylic acid in the white willow. And so that's where we will be going with this research. So yeah, it's all new. It's all quite exciting. And to me, what I find most useful about it is we are really finding these systems, these biochar, the phosphites, this willow mulch really does help our trees.
So that's Glyn. He's amazing, as I said. I'm going to put all the links to these various episodes in the show notes. But just to say, there was a problem on Apple Podcasts, particularly, where it wasn't uploading all the back episodes. So if you think that you've listened to all the episodes, you may not have done, because it was only loading the most recent 100, and there are more than that now. And if you are still struggling to find the podcasts on your app, then go and check out the website, because they are all on there now. And there's a search facility, so you can search by either category or keyword. And my next interviewee was Dr. Sandy Primrose, who's written a book about plant hunters. He's going to come back on the podcast because he's just such a good speaker. People love listening to him. And he's talking here about his book and about the challenges faced by modern plant hunters.
There are personal hazards if you do decide to go out there, and they vary. They vary from things like, if you go into the Himalayas or anywhere in the tropics, think animals like leeches and snakes are a constant hazard. Also in many parts of the world, and particularly Mexico, South America, Southeast Asia, bandits and particularly drug runners and drug smugglers. Quite a few of the plant hunters have run into them and are lucky to escape with their lives. And then the other bit you get in certain countries is just corrupt officials. Doesn't matter if you've got the right paperwork and so on, they're looking for bribes, and if you upset them, that's it. They run you out the country, and it doesn't matter how much money you've spent, your plant hunting's over.
So if you've ever harboured a desire to go plant hunting, his book may well put you off, or it might inspire you. And my last guest was James Golden, who is a gardener who based in New Jersey. His garden federal twist is very naturalistic, and he comes at gardening not as a plantsman, but as a plant lover. And he approaches it very philosophically. He thinks about the place and the garden, how it works, how it affects him, and how it affects visitors. And he talks here about what will happen to the garden if he is no longer around.
I really think of my garden as a garden that will exist until I die, and then it will fade back into the woods. I actually have given some thought to it, and maybe at some point I want to just cut it down and plant trees and start a reversion to some kind of woodland garden, more akin to what might have been there under ideal conditions in the past. I really don't know. That would be a hard decision to make. But definitely, right as I see it now, it ends when I end.
What James said there really struck me, because I've worked in historic gardens and gardens that are open to the public, and it's always a conundrum: what happens if the garden maker or the garden owner is no longer around? What should happen to that garden? Should it be preserved in aspic? Should it continue as it is? Should it evolve? And it's a really difficult thing to answer. And actually what it did was inspired me to think about how I can work more with listeners, and in particular the Patreon membership, to take questions that are thrown up by interviewees and by the podcast subjects and unpack them. Because quite often what we do is we listen to media quite passively. And I do it myself. I listen to podcasts, I listen, and then I go on my merry way. I don't always really think about and dig into what I've listened. And I thought this was such a good opportunity for all of us to get together and to take a particular topic that comes out of an episode. So my first one, which is taking place in January, is to think about this subject of the life of a garden. So what happens to a garden, as I say, if the maker or the owner isn't around to keep it going? And what we're going to do is we're going to look at historic examples of this. So particularly Penelope Hobhouse's garden and what's happened to that, which is now the Newt. And we're going to look at gardens like Great Dixter, where obviously Christopher Lloyd was the driving force. Gardens like Beth Chatto's, where these individuals made the garden, made it what it was. And what happens when those people are gone? What happens to the gardens? And what we're going to do is get together. We're all going to get some material to look into, to research, to read, and then we're going to meet up on Zoom. And out of that discussion, I'm going to take the key points that come out of it and I'm going to make a blog post out of it. And it's like a collaborative, collective media generation. So I'm thinking maybe we might call it the Garden Thought Collective, but I'm going to see what the Patreon members think of that. And yeah, I really like this idea of kind of group media production, because it shouldn't really just all be about me and what I choose and what I like to listen to. So I thought, you know, it will be on the website for everybody to read. If you also want to be involved in the production of it, then go and check out my Patreon. It's a member bonus on there. Also, as I say, I couldn't do a lot of what I've done this year without the help of the Patreon members. So I have to say a very, very big thank you to them, and I really appreciate them and their support. And thank you to you, obviously, for listening. And for those of you who have rated and reviewed the podcast, it is appreciated. It is helping spread the word. Listener numbers are going up, and it's brilliant. I think really my aim is to just get it out there to as many people who might find it of benefit to them in their gardens. So the next episode is probably going to be January the 9th or the 16th. I haven't decided yet. I am taking some time off over Christmas. So it just remains for me to say, have a happy Christmas, and I will speak to you in the new year.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.